Okay. Where was I? Yes, this week we are starting GitHub Actions, and the first few days especially should be fairly light. Who here has already played around with GitHub Actions?
Like any sort of GitHub.
GitHub Actions
Oh,
specifically. No, no one? Okay, we got one. It's good stuff. It's once you learn how it kicks off and like how to write workflows for it, it's pretty straightforward. A little like Ansible, there's more flexibility in how you write the configurations. So that will probably be the bulk of where you're going to be doing your work, troubleshooting and rewriting the configs. But the way to kick it off is fairly simple. I'm trying to find the share button here. Okay. And if you're not already familiar with where it is, it's just a tab inside of the GitHub UI. So if you go to any repository, and let's maybe go to a smaller one, as opposed to the entire curriculum, um, yeah, let's maybe look at one of today's lessons or challenges, I should say. So this GitHub Actions, if we go over to this Actions directory, we'll see a menu that asks us if we want to get started for using GitHub Actions. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow you to configure um, a particular flow. I don't recommend that we use this for now. I would say come back to looking through these workflows once you have a little more experience with GitHub Actions. Because for now, really the best way to learn is to set up a workflow yourself. So what this does is it's going to create two directories, a .github directory and a workflows directory inside of your repository. And then it's going to create just the basic configuration file. In this case, our workflow is called main, right? And if we look at today's example, yep, this should be it. We'll see a very simple configuration that we can try out. So what is this configuration? This is a workflow that should print out a statement saying, hello, DevOps. All right, so let's write it. We're going to give it a name, echo workflow. This on block is where you define the event that will trigger this workflow, okay? Remember, this whole curriculum is really built around the idea of automation, right? We're building pipelines, we're learning tools at every step of the way that allows us to set up an automated pipeline to deploy applications. GitHub Actions, one of the reasons it's maybe one of the more exciting parts of the curriculum is this is really where you get to actually deploy the app, right? Provisioning the resources in Terraform and even running Ansible playbooks, we still had to manually run those commands to provision the resources to apply the Terraform code, right? To run the Ansible playbooks on a certain set of target servers using an inventory file. With GitHub Actions, we could automate all of that. So all of that can kick off based on something as simple as a push. a GitHub push or a pull request, either or, right? So if I were to make changes and push to the main branch, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm specifying if I push to a branch and that branch is main, then we are going to trigger this workflow. Also, I want this workflow to trigger if anyone makes a pull request. And so I do the same thing. I'll write pull request, I'll write branches, and then I'll add main. So that is the event half of our GitHub Actions workflows. I always think it makes sense to kind of break things down, right, into more granular parts. And if we think about the GitHub Actions workflow as a single entity, it really only has two critical parts. That's going to be the event or the actions that trigger the workflow, and then the actual workflow itself. Okay. So here's the actual workflow itself. We use a jobs block to specify the steps that we want to run. And our first job is going to be called echo job because it's going to run the echo command. This runs on here is what is going to determine the environment that we're running this in, right? So this is very similar to, the top of a Docker file where you're specifying an image to pull from. Also similar to in AWS where you're selecting the image you want your instance to use. This is where you select the environment. So we're going to say that we want this to run on an Ubuntu, the latest version of Ubuntu, basically. And now we could actually write our steps. So our first step, we're going to give it a name. All of this is very similar so far to writing Ansible playbooks. You'll notice as well that they're both utilizing the YAML file type. And we're going to name this echo message. And we're going to run an echo command, flow DevOps. And then we're going to, I guess, just show an example of a multi-line step here. So if we wanted to have multiple steps, we could use a pipe. And in this case, we're going to print the present working directory. And let's also do an ls. It doesn't really make sense to use the pipe and only have one line that we're actually running. So let's add that second line. Okay, so now that I have this good to go, I'm going to commit. And it has been pushed. So how can I view this? If I go over to actions, we'll see that we have a different view now, right? It's no longer just showing us all these flows to choose from. It's the actual actions UI, and it's going to show us the workflows that we've created. And so far, we only have one. And within, or I should say, for this view, I've selected all workflows, but I could also select individual workflows. We can see every run instance. And if we click on that instance, we can get more data about how this job ran. Did it run successfully? Did it output any messages? This is where you see the results of everything spinning up in a virtual environment that you basically don't see otherwise, right? So if we click on this, we'll see the different steps that we created. Echo message. Well, let's start with setup job, actually. This is where we set that line saying runs on Ubuntu latest. So even though we didn't create a name for this. This is sort of like a built-in behavior to GitHub Actions. When you write a GitHub Actions workflow and trigger it, it will look for runs on. If you don't have this, it's going to fail because there's no environment specified. So that's what's happening here. It's picking out the latest version of Ubuntu. It's doing everything necessary to set it up. It's importing any permissions that we have configured already. It also shows things like the source of secrets. You'll cover that either at the end of the week or sometime next week. I'm thinking it's going to be later this week. And then it starts to prepare the workflow directory where it's going to actually start to run the steps. Okay, so it's spinning up an environment. It now has an environment to run commands in. And so it's doing that, right? It's just running commands in a shell environment. It also shows the output of those commands. And we could see in this line, we have two commands that we ran. We ran present working directory, which returned this directory. So basically our, um, I don't know what to call, what you'd call it, I guess a cursor or whatever the step is, like the thing, the entity is inside of this environment running these commands, GitHub Actions. It is running these commands inside of this directory. And when we ran the ls-a command for this directory, it returns just these two symbols, right? The present working directory and the directory above it. So it's basically saying it's an empty folder. And then it cleans up. Pretty straightforward, right? Okay. So that's a general overview of GitHub Actions workflow. Now I'm showing this to you through the UI, and I'm showing you that we wrote main.yaml through the UI. You don't have to do that. We'll walk through it again, but inside of a terminal. But first, let's kind of backtrack a bit and talk about some more general, big picture, broader concepts. Who here can, in their words, tell me, explain to me what CI/CD is?
Continuous integration, continuous development.
Mhm. And what does that mean to you?
Sorry,
What was that?
means the how software is being developed and how it's updated throughout its life.
Okay, life cycle. I think you got cut off, but I think that's what you were going to say. Yes. Can you go, can you go any deeper?
Basically, just kind of like a workflow where everyone's like kind of on the same page, and um how I don't know how to say it without like describe it without like saying continuous integration development. It's just like how it like iterates on itself, how it's like updated and stuff.
Okay. It's not wrong. Yes, workflows. I like that you use the word workflows because it's very key to the what we've been doing, right? Like we're setting up a workflow inside of Terraform and then inside of Ansible and then inside of GitHub Actions. We're creating all these temporary environments that can run various checks or builds or whatever needs to be done to keep that workflow, that overall workflow or the pipeline running operationally, right? So this is automating the deployment of an application. We have essentially a tool at every step of the way that will do something necessary to allow us to just automate the process of deploying So all we really need is that trigger, right? So we push to GitHub. Let's pretend that we have a more robust workflow. Then maybe our workflow will run a Terraform file inside of a Terraform environment, or I should say a Terraform enabled environment, right? Basically, Linux with Terraform installed. And it will run things like Terraform plan and Terraform apply, which will make changes if it recognizes changes. Otherwise, it will just succeed, and then it will send the, I guess, the build off to its next step, which is Ansible, where Ansible as a target, or sorry, as a control node will target various nodes that in,
Julius, I don't know if you're sharing the appropriate screen. I'm just seeing your
oh no, I'm this, yeah, this one, I'm just talking. Sorry. Maybe, yeah, that, thank you for calling that out though, because I think it makes a lot more sense to share this image. Okay, yes. So where was I? Yeah, Ansible. Basically, you've just covered Ansible, so it's running whatever inventory and playbooks you have set up to set up this application where it needs to go, right? And a common use case is you're going to have multiple environments. You're going to have staging servers, production servers. It can, depending on the pipeline you built, deploy only to one of those servers. And that might likely be how your organization does it. Or if you really wanted to, you could have it deploy to both as well. Now, this is an okay image. It's a little bloated, but let's break it down, okay? So the first, very, very first module we had in the curriculum, we covered very quickly, in like 3 weeks, some fundamental concepts in development, right? And we worked with Python, so we could learn how to run commands inside of a terminal, like setting up a Python virtual environment, uh, running an install inside of that virtual environment, setting up a database if one is required, creating users and database tables as required, and doing anything else that the app depends on, right? All of that is code development. We then threw Docker at you because containerization is critical in ensuring that there's consistency along every step of the way, right? So whatever part of the pipeline it hits, we can pull from a single source of truth, like Docker Hub, and have the exact same code configuration, system configuration to build and execute commands on or whatever needs to happen, right? It's showing Jenkins here, but this is just one of many, many, many um, pipeline tools. It's a scheduler, basically. It allows us to run various tests or any kind of step necessary for building and deploying an application, right? We don't have to use it since we're using GitHub Actions. There's also tools like Circle CI, which integrates into GitHub very nicely. And GitHub Actions is really a somewhat more recent tool. It's only been out for like what, 2, 3 years or something like that. I can't remember. But it's nice. It's very convenient. I think it's very well designed. It's easy to use. We don't cover any Jenkins or Airflow in this curriculum, but when you land your jobs, you'll probably end up working with something like one of those, right? And you'll learn how kind of clunky and dated some of these older tools are. GitHub Actions feels very modern and fast compared to things like Jenkins. So why bother learning things like Jenkins, right? It is likely much easier said than done, replacing a process that has been built into an organization and has been used for many, many, many years, right? So more often than not, you're going to have to learn whatever tech stack or as part of the tech stack of the organization you're hired at, because changing isn't something that could be done overnight, right? Maybe not even within a single year or a number of quarters. Okay, so that's where we're at. You can imagine here, instead of Jenkins, it's GitHub Actions. We're at this continuous integration part, right? We're integrating all of the different components of the application into a working entity, the database, the back end, the front end, and we're integrating it into like a shareable package, right? And then we send that package off to like the continuous deployment part. Now we're deploying this actual app or tech stack, and it's going to persist and live either in cloud, either on servers, and it's going to be accessible to the public. And then from there, the rest of the DevOps lifecycle is the ops part, which is really just operations and maintenance, right? Being there along the way to support software engineers as they release new features, make upgrades, make updates, etc. Help them write tests, anything to help maintain the stability, reliability, and resiliency of an application. Okay, so this first lesson, it's really just something to read through. Read through it, especially those of you who are going to be interviewing for work, because you want to be able to talk through DevOps concepts, right? And maybe we haven't really had a very formal way of practicing that, but since we're getting close to the end of the curriculum, I'm going to try to push it a little more and more. Okay, so read this. This part I don't really think is as necessary. I know we haven't been forcing you all to make PRs. You should be making PRs. You should be pushing your solutions, just getting that muscle memory of forking down a repository and working with different branches, working with different commits, building a commit history, and pushing, creating pull requests. It it just really takes repetition to get very comfortable with. And it would be better to run into all of the issues now that engineers typically experience when learning GitHub in this kind of environment versus out in like a real world environment, right? So if you haven't been pushing or using GitHub commands a lot, try to make an effort to moving forward. And really the rest of this, we shouldn't have to worry about because you should already have Git and GitHub command line installed. Okay. But it's here for review if you need a reminder for things like how to configure your user inside of an environment. Okay. What else? So those are sort of like the fundamental lessons leading up to today's main lesson, which I'd already started going over, and that's GitHub Actions. All right, so let's run through this. GitHub Actions is a DevOps automation tool provided by GitHub that allows developers to automate their software workflows directly from their GitHub repositories. It also allows developers to define custom workflows, also known as pipelines, that can be triggered based on various events like code pushes, pull requests, etc. They can combine multiple actions, perform specific tasks. You can have more than one of them. You can have workflows triggering other workflows. Um, some of the benefits of GitHub Actions over things like Jenkins and Airflow is integration with GitHub. It's right there. There's no additional setup required. I mean, automation is kind of a benefit of any automation workflow, but yes, automation is a benefit. Flexibility because we can have multiple workflows. It's very easy to set up multiple workflows, and workflows can utilize very different environments, right? Like you could have Python in one environment, JavaScript in another, and it uses a YAML syntax, which you've already got experience with through Ansible community support. Not only is there a large community of developers, but because it's integrated into GitHub Actions, it's only a few clicks away from things like raising issues, right? Um, Being able to view the other contributors to a project or repository, being able to collaborate and communicate using GitHub's interface. And it's cost effective. It provides a free tier for public repositories, and you shouldn't have to worry about hitting a limit, but it is possible to hit a limit. Like if you're just spamming workflows like every few minutes, you'll probably hit your limit before the end of the month. But if you maybe take some more time to troubleshoot errors in between each run, you shouldn't have to worry about hitting the cap. Okay, so some terminology for GitHub Actions. We've been throwing this word around a lot, but workflow, it's the bread and butter, I guess, of GitHub Actions. It's what it's there for, right? It's what it creates. It's a series of steps that can be triggered automatically through an action. So again, there's really only two halves to a workflow. It's the events that trigger it and the steps that execute after and once it's triggered. You could break down the jobs into steps. Each step can use a built-in, no, well, not really built-in, a community provided action, or you could use custom actions that anyone can create. So we see here anyone can publish and create actions in the GitHub marketplace. And if there's not an action for the task that you need to do, then you just combine a list of actions or you just run some basic commands as we saw in the echo example earlier, right? We didn't go out looking for an echo action provided by the GitHub marketplace. We just wrote the command. So for simpler things, you don't need the official capital A actions and a runner. And the runner is basically that part of the code that we saw runs on. That's where we specify the operating system that it runs on. Okay, so here in this visual, we see a user goes to GitHub because it's got like the Octocat or whatever it's called. And we can take, I guess, the code for our application and distribute to different workflows that will produce different builds. And it will go to wherever it needs to go, like the Google Play Store, the Apple App Store, etc. So more terminology. An artifact is a file or set of files produced by a job and can be used by other jobs in the workflow or other workflows. So it could really be anything that gets passed or moved around, right? Like SSH keys, um, events. Events, I kind of use this. Yeah, yeah. It makes sense to think about the actions that trigger a workflow through the word event because we use the word action to specify um, what happens inside of the job, right? Environment, it's the environment that gets spun up using the operating system you selected. And secrets are environment variables. We can create secrets through the GitHub UI, and those will be accessible inside of the GitHub Actions workflow environment. Okay, so we've already talked through this. Let's do another example now, okay, with Python. So I'm going to pull up my VS Code if I could find it. Already started playing around with this. Didn't really need to get the tests running. Kind of just wasting time there. But here I've started a project. It's got an app.py, my workflow, which is not in the right directory, requirements, and the app itself, right? So let me, for example, you should already remember how to do the virtual environments, but let's assume that this is like a new app, right? We just freshly forked it down onto our machines. We would do Python, or sorry, a source directory name, which is VNB, VENV, /bin/activate. We can confirm that it's been activated. And then this is where you would run your pip install for the requirements.txt file. I've already got all this installed, so I am good to go. My app is ready. So these commands that we're running locally, that we would run locally to get an application working, again, are the commands that you're going to want to type out inside of your workflow, inside of the job, right? Um, so this workflow here is not going to do anything because it's not in the right directory, right? So we have to, oh, I see. We're already in workflows directory, sorry. Let me move all this other stuff out of here. All this other stuff shouldn't be here. Um, so I'm just getting rid of all this stuff. I'm going to try to move it up a few directories. Okay. Looks like I should be good to go. So take back what I said. Python example YAML is in the right directory. As you can see in my local repo, I just manually created the .github directory and then the dot and then the not dot, but the workflow directory inside of the .github directory. So cd.github, do an ls, we'll see workflows. And let me double check. I think it's supposed to be workflow singular. Oh, I guess it is plural. So workflows plural. And let's start to write this workflow out. So we're going to call it workflow test.
Please. Quick question. It might be a dumb one. Do you mind opening up your little document view just so I can see the hierarchy?
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay. All right. So I'm in my project is called January GitHub Actions demo. I created a .github directory at the root of that directory. And then the workflows directory inside of that. And if I do my PWD, we'll see that, oh, I'm back in the root. Okay. I'm at the root of my project folder. I'm just gonna go back then to GitHub and workflows, just so I can see my workflow if I need to, or if I need to create other ones, I'll be able to open them a little more easily. And now that we have this, we're going to set up a very basic workflow, not as basic as the Echo one that we created. This will be a little less basic, and we may even run into some issues that we'll have to troubleshoot. So let's see what happens. The trigger for this is going to be pushing to a main branch. But actually, we already kind of did that example. Just it's not going to make a major difference right now, but I'm just going to have this go to a different branch. Okay. Now it's going to be triggered if I were to push my changes to a staging branch. Let's pretend I'm making like a staging deployment pipeline. No need for running this on a pull request. That doesn't make any sense. It made sense to run the echo hello world on a pull request because all that was doing was saying hello. Our goal with this one is to set up the Python Flask app environment, and it doesn't make sense to do that on a pull. Okay, so the jobs that I'm going to make, I'm going to make a test job. And it's going to run the test app file, which is actually probably going to fail. So I don't want to do that. We'll call this setup. I'm going to call this setup instead. And we want to specify where it runs, right? So let's just use Ubuntu latest again. Now we could specify our steps. And we're going to have our first step be called checkout code. And this is where we're going to actually use like a capital A action. Okay. So we're going to use uses, and actually also let me just so we have something to compare it to, I'm going to copy the example from the README. Do that. Just click that. Okay. So now we have another reference for another workflow looks like. I'm double checking my indentation. I think I indented too much here. YAML can be very finicky about indentation and dashes. So that's something you'll want to be mindful of when writing your configurations. Okay, so I wanted to bring this up also because I wanted to compare what's happening here, right? I said actions with like a capital A because this itself is an action, right? Lowercase a action. We're running this action called echo message. What it does is it runs the command echo and it passes in a string. Here, we're going to specify a path, okay? And that path will lead to the name of the action and the version that we want. So I'm going to call the checkout action. This is like the official GitHub Actions checkout action. And then I'm going to call another official action. It's going to use actions setup dash Python at v4. And then I'm going to specify with the exact Python version that I want. So yeah, let's just use 3.9. Could I have done something like this? Or not uses, run pip install. Well, we would already have to have Python installed. Let's say I wanted to install another version, right? Could I have done something like this? Yes, I could have. But is it better to? Ooh, I can't really, I'm trying to make a case for why it's better to use the actions. It's easier to use the action. If an action is already provided, like a capital A action, then it's faster, right? We can just rely on this as opposed to thinking through all of the commands we would have to run to manually set up Python, right? So just like with Ansible, how it was helpful to use existing roles and playbooks and all of that stuff that have already been provided, or how modules exist to give us different ways to write our playbooks. Actions exist to allow us to speed up the creation of a workflow. Okay, so this is going to set up Python. And I should actually back up a bit. Checkout is an official action that allows the environment to have access to the repository and the files in the repository as well. So if we had something like a requirements.txt, we would not be able to access it without first running this checkout actions. So here, we want to install our dependencies. We don't need an action here. We don't need a capital A action. We could just write our own. I'm going to use pipe because it's going to be a multi-line command. It's going to be the exact same thing you saw me run in my terminal earlier. It's going to create a virtual environment. It's going to then activate that virtual environment, and it's going to install the requirements specified inside of requirements.txt. Okay. And now let's actually create another job now. Now this one will be called tests. I'm wondering if this is going to spin up in a different environment. This may fail if I do it this way. I'm going to skip runs on because I'm hoping that it'll be able to repeat these steps. And all I really want this to do is run some unit tests. Okay, so run unit tests. And we're going to use that run command, passing in the PyTest command. And this should be good. I'm going to save. I'm going to do my git status. So now I have to add everything, right? So I went to my root directory. Whoops. I'm at my root directory for my project. If I do an ls, I can see all of my files. If I do a git status, I can see that I have made changes to these files. I want to add all of the changes that I made. So I'm going to do a git add present working directory, and this is going to grab all of the untracked files in the project basically because I'm at the root level, right? So it's going to grab everything. Git add, git status to verify. Okay, everything has been added. Now I can commit my changes and basically confirming, hey, this is good to go. Initial commit. The -m is for message, and you'll need to pass in a message for the commit history for tracking purposes. So I'm going to commit. It's created a commit. And this is the hash for that commit. I think we've looked at these hashes before. This is a commit history basically, and we could see this latest commit is at the top of that tree. Okay, so now that all of this is good to go, now I can push, right? And when we push to an origin. And just for demonstration's sake, I'm going to do a git remote --v. This is going to show the origins or remote repositories, I should say, because you could create additional remote repositories, right? Like a common use case is if this was coming from the DevOps organization, that would be the origin. I fork it through the UI into my GitHub, and that will be something that I'll call something like upstream, right? And then I would have two remote origin sources that I could push and pull from. I would have to specify though where I want to push and pull, right? So in this case, I really only have one remote origin or source, which is called origin. And so I should be able to do a git push without it, but I like to maintain the habit of always remembering to include the remote. So I am going to type origin, and then I'm going to type the branch name, and it's just going to go to me. Actually, should have made this. Yeah, no, I'll do this. Git push origin main. Right. Now that it's pushed, we can go to our repository. And if we look inside of actions, we'll see that nothing has triggered. Or it shouldn't have triggered. Let's see. It didn't, I see, it didn't even reach this because I have an error. Okay.
I see Ubuntu's misspelled.
Oh, good catch. Ubuntu is definitely not right. So Ubuntu, let's correct our typo. Let's also push this back. On should be aligned with name and jobs. Okay, yeah. Basically, this whole block was indented um one thing too much. So I'm gonna get status, git add, commit. Well, get status again just to check. I see the nice green color, so not commit. Fix typos and indent. Git push origin. Okay. And we have another failure. Let's see what it doesn't like now. Okay, so line 27. Okay, my run is one indent behind.
Julius, is there not a linter for YAML files?
Um, there probably is. I don't have one installed. Maybe I could look for one after this. I yeah, that might be a good idea to check out. Okay, so this is a good commit message. Give it a push again. Okay. Looks like we are, I'll just check here. Yep, looks like we are good. So notice how this time it didn't automatically trigger a workflow, right? Because we didn't explicitly ask it to. It only came up here because we had errors that we needed to fix. But as for the workflow itself, it never gets to the job portion because we didn't push under the conditions that we specified. Basically, we have to push to the staging branch, right? So I'm going to do a git checkout SB for branch. I'm going to call it STG for staging. Git status. Everything looks good. I'm going to push to my origin again, but this time I'm going to push to staging. And so I'm going to make my pull request. And that's fine. And we go to actions and we see that the workflow triggered, but something is wrong. Yes, it doesn't like what I did. So I wanted to try running this second action without specifying runs on, and it failed. It can't just infer that you want to use the same operating system as the last job, right? These are separate jobs. And so if you want tasks to utilize the same dependencies and all of that stuff, be mindful of where you put it. Okay. Okay, now who thinks this is going to fail again? If you are thinking it will, I'd love to hear your reasoning as to why.
I see above you're using uses. Do you need to add that in there as well?
I might. I might. Let's find out. So I'm going to do a git status, git add, same stuff. Oh, right. I could just do a git this. You do want to be careful about doing what I'm doing because in a real world scenario, you may not want to add everything that hasn't been unchanged, right? So I really should be more specific about what I want to add because that's the best practice, right? So I'm adding that. I'm going to commit. What did I do? Right, added runs, added runner to second job, just be a little more specific. Get push forward and staging. Now let's see what's going on. All right, it didn't fail immediately, so that's a good sign. And we should have access to. I was hoping to. No way. I was about to say I was hoping to have more um, logs to sift through, but it didn't fail for the reason I was hoping it would fail. It failed because I hit my limit. So let me see. Let's see. I'm gonna see if I could change that real quick. think I do have a few repositories that that have workflows set up, and I really just need to go through them and clean them up because they're not doing anything important. So I think I run into this almost every month. Let's see, where is billing plans inside of settings? Well, while we're here, does anybody else have their environment set up that could share their screen while I try to figure this out?
I don't.
I was just visually following along.
Okay. All right, let me. Oh, there it is. Okay. Right, so inside of yeah, just in case you're curious, inside of your settings, if you go to billing and plans, this is where it will basically let you know if you've used up your limit for the GitHub actions. In my case, I have. I can manage my spending limits, or I could increase my limits. So let's go ahead and increase that right now. Okay, I don't know how long it takes for the changes to propagate, but let's see if that works. Okay, so notice this button here. I can rerun a job if it has failed. I, and this is going to be inside a flow, okay? So just to make this clear, these are all different flows, workflow runs, I should say. You could think of each as being like an instance of the workflow being executed, right? So rerunning all jobs or all failed jobs here is only going to do so for the jobs in this particular run. So let's do that. Let's rerun all of the jobs. It's going to ask me to confirm. I'm going to say yes. Going to look at the yeah. Usually if you get to the UI, the part of the UI where it's running the code, and you click under jobs, you should be able to access the logs inside of the environment. And right. It's failing because we did not set up a virtual environment, at least not inside of the environment that it's running in. But I'm trying to think, what am I missing here? I have actions checkout. So if I've did I push my environment? Let me see. Or is the V and V? The V and V is probably inside of the git ignore, right? And one way I can confirm that is to look at the git ignore. Yep, right. So V and V or your virtual environment folder, it should be in the ignore file. It should not be pushed to the environment. That's a big no-no. It's basically unnecessary because inside of the virtual environment file is where you have the installations of all of the dependencies and packages, right? There's no need to ever include that because that's what requirements.txt is for. The idea is whenever this moves to another environment, we can use requirements.txt to rebuild all of the dependencies. So
Julius, could you go back to your code, Python example, YAML,
yeah,
and scroll down a little bit? The What is the line 23? You said activa instead of activate.
yeah. So let's fix that. Thank you. And I'm going to jump back here just to look at where it failed exactly. Okay. So yes, it would have definitely failed there, but I think it also failed one line above, or maybe it did fail there. Yes, you're right. That's exactly where it failed. Right. Okay, so we do have a line to create the virtual environment. So even though we're not pushing it here, we're creating it inside of the workspace. And I just did not finish my command. So I'm going to make a new push. Gotta add first before I commit. And I'm gonna have a message, fix typo in install step. Gonna push to my staging branch. Going to look at GitHub Actions. Nice. Okay, cool. So it's running through, it's succeeding on this job. And that's good. That's exactly what we want. That means no more typos. Now, here it's failing, which is also what we want because we had intentionally left out some necessary commands, right? So because this is inside of a different job, we no longer have access to this PyTest command, even though we ran an install for the dependencies in the environment before. The environment gets terminated. It doesn't persist, right? So as soon as it finishes running everything it's going to run, it's going to disappear into the ether. Just like when you use Docker run and you pass in the dash dash RM option. So what we can do is we can just expand on this job. Could I move this up here? Yes. But would I want to run tests every time I run the setup? Maybe actually, but just for our example's sake, we're going to keep them as separate jobs. So that means I'm also going to need to set up all this other stuff. And I'm wondering what the fastest thing to do right now is. I'm trying to think if I do have to repeat all of this or not. Let's search something real quick. Okay, yeah, this is where we could the environment itself isn't going to persist, right? But we can create artifacts on as necessary, right? So if we, for example, made this requirements.txt, we could pass it over to this uh, this job. But at the same time, we don't really need to do that because we'll have access to that same txt file if we just use GitHub Actions checkout. So let's just rerun the setup steps. I'm going to just go ahead and copy these. And I'm going to intentionally exclude the checkout just so we could see what happens. Oops, git add, mashing tab, commit Expand on test job. Get push origin STG staging. Doesn't look like the right window. Happened to, oh, there it is. Okay. All right, so we have another failure. And like Julio was suggesting earlier, would we need to reuse that checkouts action? And the answer is yes. Without that checkouts action, we're not able to access the files inside of the repository, right? So this part succeeded because it's creating files, but where it tries to look for an existing file, it's going to fail. So we would just reuse this code block, this job, and that should work. All right. I could run it again, but as y'all all saw, I've already hit my monthly limit. So just use your imaginations. It's going to succeed. It's going to pass that part. Um, and it's going to run the test. The test itself is going to fail because I never finished writing it, but the job should still succeed. Okay, so that's GitHub Actions. Any questions?
I had a question. Sorry, my dog's coming in. Do we typically have to create like our own unit test for like projects that we're going to be working on? Or is this just an example that you're providing?
It's just an example, like in a real world setting, or like,
No, just for class here for the next couple
okay.
of weeks or whatnot.
Yeah, no. They do, even in the full stack curriculum, they teach unit testing, but we don't, I'm pretty sure we don't make that a part of any of the assessments. And so likewise for us, I don't think any of the assessments have unit testing. This is just an example of what you could do inside of an environment.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. So today's lessons, again, go run through the CI/CD intro README, immerse yourselves in DevOps lingo, and then if you feel like you could use some additional exercises with Git, go ahead and run through this first one. It's a little dated. Ideally, we would just use, instead of like using wget to get some existing file from a gist or something like that, which you could do, but you'll have to have the URL handy. You could just create a repository locally, right? And I'll actually show that real quick too. So that's Git basics. That's the first assignment. And then the next one is to practice writing an actual workflow. So your workflow will have these requirements. You'll need a repository in order for that workflow to have something to work on. And that's your challenge. And one last thing I want to show is if we go back here, I want to make a new project, right? I'm going to use, instead of Git, I'm going to use GH for GitHub. This is the GitHub command line, okay? And that's different from the Git command line. So I do my dash dash help to learn a little more about it. And this command allows me to run things, run some behaviors that the Git CLI does not have, right? Like managing repositories. So I'm going to do a gh repo create. It's like the fastest way to create a repository. I'm just going to make a new one from scratch. I'm going to call it, I'm just going to call it delete because I want to delete it. And then you select the organization you want it to go to. You can give it a description. And you could set it to either public or private. You specify if you want to add a README or not. And then you specify if you want to add a git ignore. I definitely recommend yes. And it's going to ask you, well, what kind of git ignore template do you want to use? And mostly you'll either want to use Python or Node for JavaScript in this class. So let's go ahead and do Python. We don't need a license. And it's going to ask me to confirm. I'm going to say capital Y for yes. And then it's going to ask me if I want to clone this locally so that I'll have it all set up for me to do pull requests and pushes from. And there we go. I have a new repository. I do a git remote --v. It's going to give me the link. I can command click it, and we see that it's created a new repository. So I definitely recommend setting up the GitHub command line if you don't have it set up already. It can speed up your own workflow, creating workflows drastically. Okay, that's it. Let me cut the recording. Share.